much. Thank y'all for letting me come. It's a real pleasure to be with y'all today. I normally don't exceed any time limits, but if y'all want to emulate Dr. John Reed years ago at First Baptist, would get on the back row, and at 10 to 12, he'd wave his arms like an air traffic controller so we could beat the Methodists to lunch. So y'all feel free to do that. I am aware of some of the people that have been teaching recently, and I don't really teach. I ask questions more than anything else, and the basis of what I talk about is generally a question. And the question today sounds like a Sunday school question, but when you explore it more deeply, it's not. And the question I thought about this week in conjunction with a book that I'm going to discuss is, do we as a church individually and collectively really believe in grace and the notion of forgiveness? And are we really aware of all the aspects of what's involved in forgiveness? And a lot of times I think that's not true. I mean, that is true. We are in a society, we've heard this discussion lately in terms of the elections, but it's not just elections, it's probably all levels of society. There's an ongoing debate about the fraying of our institutions, our lack of community belief in the legitimacy of our institutions. People are not joining organizations as much. I'm probably speaking to the choir because all of y'all are so active. People have written books. A fellow named Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone that's talked about this phenomenon. He's written a new book called The Upswing that includes his suggestions on how to change this. And this has really infected the church. All churches, I think, across the country are seeing a dwindling of attendance. And the most recent public opinion polls have confirmed that there is a much greater segment of society that's unchurched, that's growing up not going to church. And I think a lot of it is some of it has other causes, but part of it is that in a highly media society, Christians do not reflect their core beliefs and their behavior. Just a little bit of this is about 8 or 9 years ago, my middle daughter was waitressing and she was expecting a child. And she worked at the steak place over there on Dawsonville Highway, and people fought each other not to work on Sundays. The reason they didn't want to work on Sundays is the absolute worst tippers were the people in coats and ties that had been to church. And so a lot of what I talk about seems like it's disconnected, but I promise I will do something to connect a lot of it at the end. I have just finished reading a book called Called to Forgive by Anthony Thompson. He's a minister in Charleston, South Carolina. It's not very long. It's one of the most powerful books I've ever written. He is a minister in Charleston. His wife was a minister in getting ready to teach her first Bible study in 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina. He was not able to go. He had to tend to some responsibilities at his own church. And that was the night that a young man named Dylan Roof came to the Emmanuel Baptist AME Church in Charleston. The only white person who'd ever been to that church, from what I understand. He was taken in, participated in a Bible study for 1 hour, and then he fired 60 shots, killed 9 people. He intentionally did not shoot one person because he wanted someone to be able to tell what he had done. Probably the classic definition of a sociopath, no feelings at all, never has shown any remorse. And so when I heard about this book, I'm thinking to myself, could I have forgiven somebody that murdered my wife? You know, are there some things that are so bad we don't have to forgive? Are there, what can we do to be able to forgive? The book gives a rundown of the process that he used to be able to forgive. He tells his own story. He was a parole officer for about 25 years in South Carolina. He said he was very bitter at the time. He did not have a fond feeling for white people. He said because he thought his work environment was not good. He felt like he was discriminated against. And he said he held this feeling against white society. And he became a Christian and decided to become a minister and married his wife. It was his second marriage. It was her second marriage also. And so what could a person do to forgive that? And what he talked about when he did express his acts of forgiveness, he had not planned to do it. Dylann Roof had shot and killed all these people, and he had his first court appearance, and all of the relatives of the people who were shot and killed or injured were notified they could be at the court hearing. A lot of them were there to make sure somehow he didn't get a bond, and also to express their rage to some extent. I'm familiar with a lot of this. I've seen this before in court. Usually after a person's been convicted or pleaded guilty to a serious violent crime, the victims' families are given the chance to speak. And it's almost always people looking in the eyes of somebody who's done them wrong, and they want to confront them and tell them how their actions have touched them. And that's what happened when Dylann Roof went to court, except Mr. Thompson said that he had not planned to speak, was not going to speak. And they turned to him and asked if he had anything to say. And he said he had a feeling that just came over him, that he was called to make a few statements. And his first words out of his mouth are, "Dylann, I want you to know that I forgive you." And he had not planned to do it. He said it just came out. He said that it caused him some problems within the families because they didn't want to hear that. They thought that he was somehow letting them off the hook. But in his book, he explains the process that sort of led him to have some of these feelings. One of the things he did was he listed what I call a Forgivers Hall of Fame of people that he was familiar with. One of the people was a lady named Sarah Collins. She lost an eye in the Montgomery church bombing in 1963, had a sister killed. Robert Smith was a professor at Beeson Divinity School. He had a son that was murdered just answering his door. And a robber just shot him for no reason, didn't get any money or anything. Made reference to, I can't remember when it was, but there was a number of Amish school children were murdered. 10 of them were shot years ago in Pennsylvania. And the entire Amish community went to the shooter's funeral. Not many, that's just something that is beyond my pay scale to comprehend, quite honestly. Then he quoted another person that was an African in Rwanda. She was a member of the Tutsi tribe, and her entire family had been murdered by members of the Hutu tribe in the 1990s. It's one of the biggest examples of genocide in history. He even made reference to Nelson Mandela, who became the prime minister in the early 90s of South Africa and was imprisoned for 27 years. And one of the first things that he did as prime minister is institute a process of what he called reconciliation, to forgive. And that's why I've labeled this the Forgivers Hall of Fame. In looking at this, I don't think many of us are familiar with people that have been able to do this to this extent. He does talk about different Bible verses that talk about forgiveness. One of the ones that I thought was most interesting, we don't really talk, I haven't heard taught that much at church and Sunday school, the parable of the unmerciful servant, which is, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay you back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. And most of us know the rest of the story. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Now that's a sobering biblical verse. There aren't very many people who have forgiven everybody that have wronged them in their lives. And church members are not. The human condition as such is one of the hardest acts to perform, but we don't have any choice. It's mandated. And when Reverend Thompson started discussing the actions that led him into forgiveness, he asked himself a bunch of questions. One of the questions he asked himself after he voiced forgiveness was, well, did I do the right thing? People came up to him and said, you've left out a critical part of the forgiveness equation, and that is repentance. He didn't repent. He didn't accept your forgiveness. He didn't ask to be forgiven at any time. And Dylan Roof has never, ever done that. The shooting was in 2015. He's still on death row and has never uttered any hint of contrition. It's similar to the Oklahoma City bomber in 1995 at the Oklahoma post office, where Timothy McVeigh killed so many people with a bomb. When he went to sentencing, he basically mocked the victims' families, and he quoted a poem, I think it was by Henley, I'm the captain of my fate, I'm the master of my soul, and basically just did the equivalent of a verbal bird to every member of every family that he had killed. And even then, in the Thompson book, he quoted people that had been able to forgive this man. But the first question is, do you believe one-sided forgiveness is invalid? And does true forgiveness depend on a person accepting their role or their culpability? And Thompson says that if you take that view of forgiveness, then you become a captive of the wrongdoer, that he holds you captive the entire period of time that you're waiting for some sort of repentance or acceptance. And he said, so true forgiveness cannot be dependent on that. And he said that God's forgiveness for all of us was not, he gives us forgiveness whether or not we choose to accept it. And his forgiveness is there. And whether we choose to accept it or not. The next question that he addressed was, are there crimes and people who are irredeemable that we don't have to forgive? And the important distinction that he made in the book was the biblical conception of forgiveness and whether or not a person has to deal with the consequences of their actions in court or anything like that. And he says those are two different questions. And he never went to a judge and said, let this man out of jail, I forgive him. But he looked into his eyes and said, I forgive him. And one of the strongest points that Thompson made in his book was, when we think of the irredeemable crimes, all we have to do is look in the Bible for examples that a lot of the strongest leaders in the Bible in the Old and New Testament were what society would call irredeemable sinners. Paul was an assassin. I mean, Paul murdered tons of people. We don't have a numerical count, but we grow up in the church studying Paul's teachings, and we don't always recognize the extent of the change in his life and the forgiveness that was extended to him. And one of the most interesting parts of the forgiveness that Paul experienced was not just God's forgiveness, but that he was taken into the community when he started his ministry. He met a lot of people that questioned him, but they ultimately took him into the community. And the early Christian community is a model of forgiveness is at the core of our beliefs, and that we do not believe that there are irredeemable sins. So why did Anthony Thompson forgive? And one of the best statements I've ever seen about forgiveness is a quote in the book where he's quoting C.S. Lewis, and he said, "I forgive him because I truly believe that to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable, because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me, and that to refuse to offer forgiveness is to refuse God's mercy for ourselves." I don't know that I've ever seen forgiveness synopsized in such a succinct and to the point way, but that pretty much tells the story of what we have to do. You know, I talked at the beginning about a lot of times when I start a lesson, people don't understand any connection between two strands of thought that I talk about. One of them that I was talking to you about is, do we really believe in mercy? And number two, how it relates to the disintegration of society and our religious community. And one of the things that I thought about in that connection was just the nature of church. And one of the other things I thought about was Robert shared with me Bill Coates' lesson, I guess it was a couple of months ago, where he was talking about we do not need that old time religion because God calls on us to evolve. And one of the thoughts that came to me, and it's just my thought in reaction to all of this, is that we grow up in a church basically worshiping as a spectator. When I first started going to First Baptist in the mid 60s, you know, Gainesville was a smaller town. Just about anybody in business that moved to town in the 60s and early 70s, if they were in business, they either joined First Baptist or they joined First Methodist. Whether they believed anything or not, that was just the culture of the time. You did it. Some people probably did it just because they felt it was a business necessity. Then the person's family might stay in that church, or they'd go to another church in the community. But it was pretty much First Baptist, First Methodist. That was back in the time when the Catholic Church was that, 2 or 3 room office that Dan McGill, the architect, used to be in across from the hospital. And you go to church on Sunday mornings, go to Sunday school. In the Baptist church, they have training union on Sunday nights. On Wednesday night, you'd go to RAs. But it was more a matter of, well, for a lot of people, and sometimes myself, you go to church, A, because you're expected to, B, because a good person goes to church, and C, your parents made you then. Not as many do now. But we, in some ways, I think a lot of us have become spectators, and we view our religious obligation in getting in the car and driving to Thompson Bridge Road or Green Street to our local congregation. But we do not fully, we hear the teachings of the church. All of us have heard this injunction that we have to forgive, but one of the things it seems to me for the church to basically restore itself and re-energize itself is for more of an emphasis in the church to be, how do we take what we hear in church and apply it to our own conduct? And along those lines, questions that I've asked myself are, what do I need to forgive and what do I need to be forgiven of? And I started making a list, and I thought of some people that I thought had wronged me. It's a lot easier to think of the people who have wronged you than the people you have wronged. I thought about, I mean, you think about this, you think about disagreements you've had with your children, your neighbors, people you might not be on speaking terms with that you've known for 20 or 30 years. Spouses on a day-to-day basis you have a disagreement with, ex-spouses. You know, and that when you start talking about things like that, that's where you really, where the rubber hits the road. You know, it's easy to forgive your spouse, particularly when in my case, she has a lot more to forgive me for than vice versa. But people who have really done things to you, that's a different matter. Thompson talked in his book about one of the reasons why conditioning forgiveness on the reaction of the wrongdoer is this. He says, it's not true. He says, it keeps many people from experiencing the peace that come from forgiveness. And that's one of the byproducts of forgiveness, if you think of that. One of my best friends 5 years ago, he had to go see his mother up north. He had not spoken to her in 30 years, or it may be longer than that. He had been shipped off to boarding school, military boarding school, when he was 7 years old. His dad died during World War II. And his mom shipped him to boarding school, and he felt like she was just getting rid of him because she had been remarried. And over the years, he had absolutely no relationship. This person is not particularly religious, but along the lines of why we should forgive, and the byproduct of forgiveness is he came back to Gainesville, and he told me, he said it was the strangest thing. He said, when I saw my mother, I started crying. And I didn't ask her for forgiveness. I didn't ask her why you did this to me. He said, I just said, I'm sorry. And all of a sudden, she did respond to him. And he told me that it was like a burden on his back that had been taken away. And from a practical standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, when you think about things that you carry with you for a lifetime, and it's like a snowball, the more time that passes, the bigger that it gets. But it is a benefit to the forgiver if you can get to the point of doing what you're supposed to do. How do you forgive? Reverend Thompson said that the nature of forgiveness, in his opinion, was it was an act of will, an act of love, and he contrasted biblical forgiveness from societal forgiveness. Societal forgiveness demands that a person repent and conditions forgiveness. Biblical forgiveness never conditions any response on the person to be forgiven in order for the forgiveness to take place. Along the lines of what I was talking about forgiveness being a load that's lifted from you, one of the best definitions of the benefits of forgiveness I've ever read was a quote in the book by Mr. Thompson, and it was by a person named Lewis Smedes, S-M-E-D-E-S. I don't know who he is. When we genuinely forgive, we set a prisoner free and then discover that the prisoner we set free was us. That's a beautiful translation, a distillation of the effect of forgiveness. Along those lines, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was, what's the effect of non-forgiveness? When we talked about it, you carry a burden your whole life. And Thompson made a reference to a gentleman named Simon Wiesenthal. I probably mispronounced it. Some of you would recognize that name. He was a famous Nazi hunter. He spent his entire life trying to out former prison guards who had participated in torture and killing Jews. And in the book, there's a quote from Wiesenthal when he was in his middle to late 80s. And he said the regret, not necessarily the regret of his life, but the question that had nagged him his whole life is, ought I to forgive? What he was talking about was he was approached, I think shortly after he had been freed from a concentration camp, and a large number of he had like 89 relatives that were executed during World War II. And a German guard, former German guard, approached him and said, before I die, I've got to ask for forgiveness for all the evil that I perpetrated. You know, they said that the gentleman was crying and just in tears. And Wiesenthal said he didn't have it in him to forgive. He turned and walked away. And for over 60 years, he asked the question, ought I forgive? And I think we know from the teachings of Jesus what the answer to that, but we know how hard it is. So heading into a conclusion today, this is all fine and good. Yeah, Hammond, we're supposed to forgive. You didn't tell me anything new. I'm guessing most of you, and the ones of you in the class that I know y'all been going to church for years. You've been hearing this story of grace for years. And the question I ask myself is, do I really believe it? And does my life reflect my belief in grace? An act of forgiveness can have an effect, not even if a person doesn't accept the act of forgiveness, it can have revolutionary changes. And what I thought was interesting in the book was Thompson said that he had had a number of people that questioned him about what he had to say. And then he went around preaching about what he discussed in the book. And as a result of his expressions of forgiveness and some of the other church members too, I read about this, but I thought it was pretty extraordinary. there was a 15,000 person human chain shortly thereafter, where 15,000 people joined hands from around the area of the church to a white suburb in an act of solidarity. And right after that, Nikki Haley, who was the governor of South Carolina, just took it upon herself to pull down the South Carolina state flag, which had some of the rebel battle symbol on it. And that had been a huge point of contention. That would have never happened, according to Thompson. And everything I've read seems to indicate that too, that one act bridged political differences and was a unifying act. And it illustrates the power of forgiveness. So going back to what does this have to do with not having anybody in our church pews? I think it has a lot to do. We sit around at church worrying about, we don't have enough bodies in the pews. How are we going to pay the bills? And I would pose the question to myself and to other people this: if we took Jesus's teachings about forgiveness to heart, would we really have to worry about having enough seats in the church? One thing that I read that was several years ago was that some historians believe that the growth of the Christian church was expedited in the face of Roman persecution, because it was the Christian community that ministered to the sick, that ministered to lepers and people that were dying. And it was the Christian community that shared their belief in grace by loving the unlovable and treating the unlovable. It seems to me that grace is not just limited to forgiveness, but it's also limited to, it extends to Jesus's injunction and commands to us to share our thankfulness at the grace we've been given, not just by forgiving other people, but by acting as a community and individually to love the unlovable. If 600 people on a Sunday morning on Thompson Bridge Road or on Green Street left the church service and really took forgiveness to heart, what kind of revolution would that spark in our community? And it seems to me that little steps like that are the key to the church evolving in the 21st century, where we don't wither away. So that's pretty much the gist of what I had to say today. I'm not used to being a ringmaster on Zoom, but I did want to leave open any opportunity for any comments or questions or any observations anybody wanted to make. It's 10:46. I'll leave it open for real brief time because I know y'all want to get to your service. Was anybody have any observations or comments? Well,
I have a question, Hammond, and I'm going to direct it to Ferris because she's an ordained Methodist minister. And when I know young or ministerial candidates coming up before the Board of Ordained Ministry for ordination, have a lot of questions they have to answer, a lot of things they have to write. And one of the things has to do with their belief or their understanding of prevenient grace, which seems, and I don't know if that's a term that the Methodist Church particularly has made a part of their theology. But I'd like for Ferris just to maybe explain what that means in terms of the Methodist Church and our faith in general. If she heard me.
Muted.
I think she hasn't unmuted herself.
She has not unmuted, right. Ferris, can you unmute?
Okay, here I am. You hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Prevenient grace is the grace that goes before you, that is leading you toward God from the beginning of life.
Okay. Is that more Methodist theology? I mean,
well, it's a term that I believe John Wesley originated. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that would be Methodist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
David Barnett's an expert on prevenient grace.
Well, I'm gonna, unless anybody has any observations they want to add, I want to let everybody go to church. And I've said about what I meant to say.
Hammond, let me thank you again for coming. And I have a feeling this week there's going to be individually and as couples or as friends, there's going to be some talking about this and thinking about this, because it's certainly something that I struggle with myself. So I want to thank you for bringing these thoughts, for introducing us to that book. And I think we all remember seeing on TV some of the other people from that situation at Mother Emanuel Church offering forgiveness. And you would see on newscasts people just being amazed that they could forgive. So thank you for raising this up for us and giving us some food for thought. Appreciate you so much.
Thank you.
Thank y'all very much.
Thank you.
Come back.
Let's see.
Thank you, Linda.
Have a good week, all.
See, I'm afraid here